Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the afternoon session. This particular session is named Water and Peace. Now, as some of you may know, I'm a student of international politics, and when I was studying international politics, we never talked about water and peace. It was not a question. In fact, we were aware that there were maybe shortages of water in some parts of the world, but these were in faraway lands. It was not a global problem. We were not concerned about them. And then in 1970 or so, I began to read writings about water wars all of a sudden. Interestingly enough, these were mainly concerned with the Middle East and not other parts of the world. But slowly, the topic became more and more current, and we suddenly came against the hard reality that the resource called water that we use so freely, in some ways so irresponsibly, was a commodity that we could run out of, and we would no longer be able to meet our needs. And this would be a major challenge to our civilization. I mean, in fact, when I first read about water, it was as a student of political science. There was a German historian, sociologist called Karl Wittfogel, and he talked about why some societies evolved around water. And he referred to these as hydraulic societies. But that was it. But now, we as a civilization, we are a hydraulic civilization, and if we lose our water, we may stop being a civilization. So we are facing a rather important challenge. Now, nevertheless, let me point to another problem, and it is this. When we say water and peace, well, I mean, if you are thinking in terms of antonyms, the antonym of peace is war. So by couching the argument in peace, you are essentially incorporating the possibility of war into the situation. Maybe this is not the way we should proceed, but we should redefine the problem, not necessarily as water and peace, but using our water resources efficiently to meet our global needs of water. However, if I may offer some consolation, at least the way Turkish and Arabic languages function, peace in Turkish, and as you see it here, is barış. So, but then there is another word which in English can only be expressed as peace of mind. In Turkish and Arabic, huzur. And what we really ought to aim for is not peace per se, which would suggest the possibility of war, but a peace of mind so that we can all enjoy the good things the world has to offer us without considering the possibility that we might fight over them. But these are my simple thoughts, but actually we have a highly qualified panel who will be discussing these matters, and your programs, and all of you have programs, have not only the names of these people, but also their life stories. So if you haven't read them, just page through them, because you will discover that we do have indeed a very impressive group of people here. Now, I will start actually with President Danilo Turk. When I first met him, it was quite some years ago in Ljubljana itself, and of course the name of Turk for a president of Slovenia was just very, very exciting. So the excitement continues. In fact, I noticed that people were so excited. In some of the communications I got, they had the umlauted you for your name, which I trust you don't have in the writing of your name. So, but it's certainly a pleasure to have you here. As you know, Professor Turk and President Turk is the chairman of Global High-Level Panel on Water and Peace. So these people made the same mistake of the antonym problem. But let me ask you this, President. I mean, on November 22, 2016, you briefed actually the United Nations Security Council at the opening of the thematic debate on water security and peace. And 61 member states of the United Nations took part in this debate, and including all the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. What came out of this debate? I mean, was it useful? Was it just an exercise in oratory with no outcomes? How do you assess this debate? Did it make people more aware? And what motivated the Security Council, in fact, to put this debate on its agenda? Was there some immediate problems that prompted it, or some pressures? And, well, of course, this all essentially leads me to the next question, because when these issues come up, we talk about them. The critical thing is, of course, follow up. What happens afterwards? So I asked you a lot of questions. Now it's your turn. You have, well, maybe 15 to 20 minutes, or less. Very good.
Thank you, Professor Turan, for this introduction. And let me say, I mean, there is always a simple and a complicated answer to any question. Now, the simple answer to your question of why the Security Council took up this subject for a discussion is this. There is a growing sense of urgency. It was not like that before, but I think the way the most recent armed conflicts were conducted, in particular in Syria, also in Iraq, before that in Darfur, and in some cases in Somalia, water has become much more central to the whole process of conflict formation and also to the process of conflict resolution. If one looks just into the news of the last few days, the whole attention to the Tabqa Dam situation in Syria really gives you a good example of why there is a serious concern, and that concern also involves the Security Council. It is quite natural that for that reason the Council is increasingly putting water elements into its resolutions. So, you know, the time is coming to take up this matter more directly. Now, this was the simple answer. Now, let me give you a complicated one. The complicated one has to do with your very subtle and nuanced consideration of the concept of peace. Two concepts of peace. One could think about Isaiah Berlin, two concepts of liberties, two concepts of liberty. Now we have two concepts of peace. Peace as absence of war, or peace as peace of mind, as a kind of a more general sense of tranquility and friendliness. Now, you see, different civilizations have different traditions in that regard. I'm coming from predominantly European tradition, which is influenced by the Greek history of ancient Greece and Greek mythology. It is very important to know that in the Greek mythology, there was a goddess of peace. You know, there was a god of war, Ares, of course, who was a very flamboyant and very energetic god. But there was a goddess of peace by name of Irene. And Irene was first female. Second, she was of poor health. She was on the verge of dying. But she was immortal, as all gods and goddesses were. So that tells you a little bit about how the European civilizational tradition, influenced by Greek mythology, understood this kind of a limited notion of peace. Peace as an absence of war, and peace which may always slide back into war. And we are, I think, still very much victims of this sort of perception, and that, I think, influences much of what is happening in the international scene, and much what shapes the current state of discussion of water and peace. Now let me come to water more directly in this context. When the Council defined the item of its agenda, it didn't simply say water and peace, it said water, security, and peace. So they added the element of security because it was understood that one has to broaden the agenda in the sense that security issues may not be caught into dichotomy between war and peace. I mean, sometimes it is important to address security issues more directly, and therefore address the problem of war and peace more indirectly. And that is what the Security Council did. So it opened up the possibility of discussion that didn't refer to the specific items on the agenda of the Security Council at this point, or the specific situations, most terrible, dramatic situations, Syria, but also look at the issues more generally. So many speakers among 69 member states who spoke, and all members of the Security Council are included, they spoke about such benign things as Helsinki Convention on Water Courses, 1992 convention, which speaks a lot about various ways of addressing water cooperation, dealing with questions of quantities and quality of water, dealing with questions of different consultations needed around that, possibility of dispute settlement, and so forth. So the agenda became much larger. And of course, if one asks a question of what is expected from this to happen, I would say one would expect the Security Council to develop a more sophisticated policy framework for addressing water issues in all situations which are on the agenda of the Security Council, which can potentially enter the agenda of the Security Council. Now, here I have to go back to the traditions and to the practices of the Security Council. I think that the platform upon which the Council will deal with issues of water and peace will essentially relate to protection of civilians. We all know that this has been woefully inadequate in recent armed conflicts, that international humanitarian law provides for a much more robust protection of civilians. But the fact that the international community and its institutions, including in particular the Security Council, have largely failed in protecting civilian populations, really call for a different policy approach, for a more robust policy approach. And there are many elements of Security Council-led policy that are entering the picture: water, protection of water resources and water installations being one of them. Now, the understanding that water resources and water installations must not be made objects of attack or used as weapons of war is not new. That has been there with the international humanitarian law from before. But it has never been seen as a really important priority in the work of the Security Council and in the politics that is happening around the Security Council. So I believe that the recent discussion has shown that the international community is moving towards a more sensitized understanding of the gravity of the problem, seriousness of the problem, and the need to develop a kind of a policy framework to guide the decision makers in the future. Why is this important? Well, first of all, it is important because the recent history has shown the tragic dimensions of the problem. But on a more long-term, in a more long-term perspective, it is important because one can assume that with the effects of global warming, with the general reduction of, or let's say, the general scarcity of water becoming more and more prevalent problem in many parts of the world, this issue has to be put closer to the center of attention of the Security Council. I would like to conclude by saying that obviously the Security Council cannot produce miracles, and usually when things enter the agenda of the Security Council, they are already very bad and very difficult to handle. And I hope that the fact that the Security Council is approaching the issues of water and peace now would be also used as a wake-up call to many others. I think UN and the organized international community in general have to understand that water is a dramatic problem. Water is not simply a matter for specialists to whom one can delegate it and everything will be fine. So water requires political attention. Water requires policies that may not relate to wars directly, but are important as a long-term factors of stability and peace. And if that is helped through the discussions of the Security Council, that in itself would be a contribution. Next year, we'll have a big summit on water in Brasilia in March. There will be a great deal of activity going on relating to the Sustainable Development as Goal 6, which is about water and sanitation. And I think if the sense of drama is helped by the engagement of the Security Council, that I think would also make those discussions more practical and more, how should I say, result-oriented. My final comment would be this. The international arena on water cooperation is very diversified, some would say fragmented. There is a need to really come to something more coherent if the world wants to address this problem adequately. How to do it is not yet clear, but this sense of need must be there. Secondly, there are certain time-tested mechanisms of water cooperation which should be explored and applied more ambitiously. In Europe, this morning we heard the Deputy Minister of Romania talking about the Danube system. Now, Danube system came into being gradually after the War of Crimea in 1856. You know, what can we learn from such an example? First of all, that there is a link between peace and water, or water and peace. And secondly, that we have to be really very persistent and think about the long-term nature about water cooperation systems. The Danube Commission in 1856 was really about navigation in the lower part of the water course, and it was part of the overall geopolitics of Europe at that time. But today it is a much more diverse, much more comprehensive system dealing with all kinds of issues of ecology, economy and everything else. It involves civil society, it involves many others. And I think that this kind of historic experience have to be brought into our memory now and also help us to understand the importance of what is being sought through this, definition or through this identification of water as an element of peace. Now, this, of course, was a longer and more complicated answer, but I'm sure it was not a definitive one, so there is much more to say.
Of course, I mean, every question in itself warrants a conference maybe, but, apart from the fact that you talked to the Security Council, essentially you had this global high-level panel on water and peace. With whom else do you speak, or who else do you encourage to discuss and work on these questions? Does that involve many civil society organizations? And who actually gives the means with which you can operate? And I think this would be interesting because we are in need of organizations that address these questions at the national level, and maybe your experience would give us some clues as to how to proceed.
Well, very briefly, the panel was established at the initiative of 15 co-convening countries. So there is a group of concerned UN member states that have decided to initiate the panel. This group includes countries from all regions of the world. They are the ones who are making the work of the panel possible. They are also the ones who have initiated the Security Council activity. This last year Senegal was in the lead as a member of the Security Council and as a country with a very interesting experience in the field of transboundary water cooperation with 4 of its neighbors or 5 of its neighbors, Guinea, Gambia, Mauritania, and Mali. So, country which has really solid experience and was interested in bringing these issues closer to the center of attention of the Security Council. Now the Council composition has changed. We have Sweden on the Council with a long tradition of work on water issues, and since sensitized to the importance of the subject, there are other countries which have joined recently, like Kazakhstan, with the entire Central Asian experience in that regard. I'm trying to give you a sense of what motivates a certain number of countries to get involved in that discussion. And I'm very happy to see that Turkey is interested in this discussion also by having invited me to this forum. And I hope we'll have more of that as we proceed in the United Nations in the future. And I, of course, have to be modest. I mean, the panel was established to work for 2 years, to produce a report, make a few recommendations, and then, of course, it would be up to the member states primarily to see what to do about them, and also others. We are not addressing only member states or only the United Nations, but also civil society groups and financial centers. We're talking about creation of a blue fund in our report and so on. And that there will be, I'm sure, also interest among the scientific community, which is getting increasingly worried about the ways things are developing in various parts of the world. So the panel is a modest expression of a much larger concern, and we hope to be able to address that concern with a selected number or a limited number of well-meaning and hopefully meaningful recommendations.
Well, thank you very much. I think your explanations are, in a sense, encouraging. What I see in the international arena is that building consensus takes an inordinately long period of time. Sometimes the problems to which these meetings are to offer a solution take too long to provide a solution for the problem, which advances at a faster pace than the ability of the international community to develop solutions. I hope this is not going to prove to be the case in the case of water. In fact, you know, sitting next to you is a man who is really living through these significant problems that a society faces because it's not blessed with enough water, but it is blessed with quite a number of refugees these days, right? And now, in fact, Jordan hosts, the numbers vary, but sometimes they say 700,000, but I've heard numbers as high as 1,300,000 Syrian refugees, and this is about 20% of Jordan's population, right? Now, this flood of Syrian refugees must have impacted Jordan's ability to bring about human and development programming. I mean, not only for the refugees, but for the population as a whole. And, you know, the water resources of the country that were not necessarily abundant must be going under very severe strain. How do you cope with this? What kind of problems do you have to deal with? And, you know, these problems, we always tend to focus on water, but actually the use of water, its distribution, etc., is part of a broader sort of system of problems that are social, economical, and political. Now, it's always easy to ask questions. This is what I'm doing. Now, I've asked the question, you give us the answers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear panel members and ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to you all. Maybe for many who know about Jordan water problems, but Jordan is among the most water scarce countries of the world. And in 2010, it was among the 10 poorest water countries as defined by the UN ranking water poor countries. And it is total water availability in the country, the renewable water, is 1 billion cubic meters per annum. And after the arrival of the waves of the Syrian refugees, hundreds of thousands of them arriving suddenly, now in 2017, Jordan is the second water scarce country of the world. Second.
Who's first?
Yeah, this is the way that you divide the available water on the number of people. So the per capita water in Jordan is less than 100 cubic meters per year, which is 200 times less than the water per capita in Turkey. And we have to deal with our water needs for agriculture, for industry, for potable domestic uses with that much little water. So the Syrian conflict is perhaps the most tragic humanitarian crisis of our time. Since 2011, half of the Syrian population, which is about 11 million, have to leave their country as refugees for neighboring countries or become internal refugees in their own countries. Others now look for refuge in neighboring countries, and others are risking their lives to take the dangerous trips to Europe, hoping for opportunity and acceptance. Jordan hosts now around 1.3 million Syrian refugees, as you mentioned, Your Excellency, nearly 20% of the Jordanian population. And this places considerable strain on Jordan's socioeconomic foundations. The influx of the refugees has become the foremost challenge facing Jordan, undermining decades of hard-earned developmental gains and exhausting what little resources are available to its people. Currently, the neighbor countries of Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey host almost 4.8 million registered refugees. Jordan alone provided refuge to 1.3 million Syrian refugees, among which are 655,000 registered refugees. Many of them have now entered into a cycle of self-depleting of their resources, and that has adapted to cutting on their food consumption and engaging in illegal labor in the country. Ladies and gentlemen, Syria crisis has a multifaceted impact on Jordanian people and institutions, and aggravating economic and social factors, and is impacting the whole country from the onset of the Syria crisis till 2016. The direct cost of hosting these Syrian refugees have reached about 8.5 billion Jordanian dinars, and this as a result of electricity, water, subsidies, and healthcare services, infrastructure services, and transportation sector subsidies, illegal labor, and security costs imposed on Jordan by this situation. Since 2013, the cost of hosting Syrian refugees averaged at around 16% of the Jordan national budget. Every year, fiscal budget, 16% of it is spent on refugees. While the international community has been supportive toward Jordan, development and humanitarian have not kept pace with the increasing needs and requirements of refugees. Recognizing that the existing situation is unsustainable for Jordan, and as international partners have agreed on a paradigm shift that promotes economic development and opportunity for all, and provide further financial support to Syrian refugees, hosting countries, and Jordanian institutions. On its ongoing effort to further improve the holistic response to the impact of the Syrian refugees, Jordan has took a pioneering initiative by signing the Jordan Compact during the February 2016 at supporting the Syrian and Refugee Conference in London. Through the Jordan Compact, the government sought to transform the refugee crisis into a development opportunity and attracts new incentives and instruments from the EU and other markets to relax the origin of exports so that Syrians and Jordanians can benefit from this. Jordan has also been working hard on mobilizing sufficient resources to secure access to formal education to 50,000 Syrian children in the 2017 school year. And it has also issued 30,000 work permits to Syrians to work in Jordan. Although the London conference have been able to mobilize an amount of $11 billion in pledges for Syria and its neighboring countries, only a share of what promised by the international community has been transferred into real disbursement to mitigate the impact of the crisis on Jordan. In particular, although the international community are identified and determined to help Jordan, it has nevertheless fallen short of the needs and requirements defined by the latest Jordan Response Plan of 2017-2019. This is a symbolic of the failure of the international and traditional model according to which host countries provide protection space to refugees while the costs are borne by the international community. The defect of this model lies in the fact that the international law, the UN Refugee Convention of 1951, relating to the status of refugees, requires host countries to provide refuge and not expel people who face genuine threat of persecution in their home countries, and yet the international community has no legal regulations or commitment to finance and support the host countries of the refugees. And countries that there is no law to oblige the country to expel and don't allow their citizens to come back, and this is the deficiency in this law. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, you referred to sort of this Convention on Refugees. I mean, it seems that the UN Convention on Refugees, which you referred to, was actually prepared in 1951, where the problem of refugees were quite different than the refugee problems we're facing now. So, I mean, I don't think in 1951, anybody imagined that, 4 million Syrians would be refugees in various parts of the world. This is a problem of a different order than the period during which this convention was prepared, because at that time, the refugee problem was conceived mainly as people escaping the so-called Iron Curtain. And these were few in numbers, and they were all coming into Europe, Western Europe, and Western Europe was quite ready to accept them. So within those boundaries, the rules that were developed were very different than what we need now. So maybe, Mr. President, this is something that should be focused on, among other things, in your efforts at the United Nations as well. But, since I've got you, Mr. Bino, I mean, you've talked about the refugees, but, I mean, you're a man from the area where the water shortages and the sort of water wars talk emanated. I mean, this is where it came from. So, I mean, what are the obstacles that you see as standing in the way of cooperation on water in our region in the Middle East? And what do you think are the major impediments to this?
The academics and researchers point out that this Geneva Convention now is outdated and it's have no context in the existing situation. And this refugees of today are a result of conflicts inside the countries and war, and this are happening suddenly. Just Syrian crisis started over 3 months. There were small skirmishes in the south, and 3 months it was all exploding into a major war and major. So the refugees get out, flee the country, and the receiving countries help them based on the humanitarian understanding. But when the situation persists and goes for years, then it becomes a problem of resources. I think there is some sort of lack of responsibility of the international community to support the receiving countries, the refugee host countries. And at the same time, other countries, maybe I would mention Australia, spend a lot of money on stopping the refugees coming into their country. They have offshore locations to bring all the refugees or boat people there. They spend a lot of money, so there is unbalanced distribution of resources by the developing countries. And in the Syrian situation, the receiving countries have reached the limit of their ability to support these.
Oh, thank you very much. Actually, of course, in addition to sort of people from the area, countries from the area that address these questions, we have this nice country up north, which is blessed with water, maybe without enough sun. I mean, they may be jealous of our sun, but certainly we're jealous of the water the North has. And of course, Therese Sjömander Magnusson is essentially the director of a transboundary water management and UNESCO International Center for Water Cooperation in Stockholm. And as you know, the Swedish government is always very willing and helpful to bring about peace in highly conflictual situations. Your agency is only one of the several agencies in Stockholm that address questions of peace. Not all of them necessarily focus on water, but I noticed that you use the word transboundary water, which is the reality, but in the United Nations tried to escape this expression by using international waterways, and sometimes they are not ways, but now you do a lot of work on what the so-called water diplomacy, and this has been evolving as an important process, and that can certainly facilitate or support inclusive and peaceful cooperation in addressing water problems. And I trust your agency has accumulated a bit of experience. I know from my own observations, sometimes cooperation proves difficult, mainly because the sides that could cooperate and easily overcome problems simply cannot do that because they're not talking to each other. So communications are lacking, or sometimes they start with the wrong issue. So rather than beginning the problem-solving process, you start developing a small problem into a bigger one. So share some of your experience with us. I mean, you know, what are some of the things that you do? What are the different ways governments tend to engage in water diplomacy, and what would you tell them to do or not to do? So.
Thank you, Professor Turan. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And we do indeed have no sun in Sweden. Right now we have -degrees, but we do have water. I am fortunate to work for a water institute, so we do not represent Sweden as such. We're an independent foundation, and I've been working with supporting governments and organizations on cooperation around shared waters for almost 20 years. And to follow what Mr. Turk was starting with, there is probably an easy answer and a broad complexity to that. But I would say that apart from listening, which is key and fundamental, it is incentive structures and interdependencies which we have to focus on in our support to these processes. And I will come back to those a bit later.
Do you offer some incentives yourself?
Yes.
All right.
Now, it has to be made clear that we are an impartial facilitator of the dialogue, and to us, as an organization, we build on the demand from riparian governments. That is absolutely important. But I would like to come back to the topic of water and peace. And we need to, there is different levels of complexities here. It's not either or, and that is something that we always come back to. It's not peace or war. It is really different levels of tensions. It can be a dispute over one issue, and there can be collaboration on others. That's something we've seen across the world. There are different scales to water and peace, and where water can really be the catalytic force. At the global level, we heard about the Security Council, we have the regional perspective, but more and more, due to the fragmentization within countries, we also see that there are many challenges evolving around disputes, even at sub-regional, national, and local level across a shared river, which we need to really understand better. I also want to bring in the multi-level approach. Now, this can sound as a very, we always say that we need to cross sectors and we need to understand each other better, but that is really key. We need to understand that in terms of cooperation around shared waters, we have to deal with the technical experts who knows water issues, but in the same time, we need to understand how politicians think and prioritize, and we need to understand the needs of the citizens and the public opinion. All of that really, that is the interface that we here in this room have to work with. Another dimension I would like to add is time. These different, if we call them stakeholders, all refer to different time horizons. A politician is elected for a number of years. The development aid and the pledging of global funds is multi-year. All of that needs to be balanced, and you have to find the most appropriate level. And most importantly, as CIWI, we are engaged in facilitating dialogue. The number one question we ask ourselves is who is in the room, who is not in the room, who should be in the room, and who influences the people who are in that room. So I've been very fortunate, as I said, have been working on these issues at different levels, from communities in Africa, sharing the same rivers, to a very high global level. And I would say that communication is key, listening is key. But what we are more and more, the trend we see is that, as CIWI, is that we need to look for broader benefits beyond water. This is a concept that was introduced many years ago, but what we see more and more in different parts of Africa, for example, is that intra-regional trade, for example, is an added value, an added benefit to cooperation over water. Joint irrigation schemes, joint investment programs, infrastructure investments broadly. Apart from looking at the broader benefits, I would say always manage expectations. I was referring to people who are in the room, and it is key to understand what each government representative, civil society, religious leader, or whoever is there, what their expectations are, and really start to have realistic expectations and create a sense of a shared vision. And finally, in terms of the process as such, always be prepared to manage uncertainties. That's part of the political context of shared waters, and that's really important to stress. I'd like to conclude with a couple of examples, because we work throughout over the globe in different regions, different countries, different contexts, but we have gradually started to address so-called opinion leaders. It can be advisors to a minister, it can be an advisor to an investor, it can be, in many cases, the media. We all know that media should reflect upon the issue of sharing waters, and I'd like to take an example from the Nile River Basin in Eastern Africa, which we implemented not even a year ago. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Nile, but this is a river basin where we have been involved in supporting the governments for a very long time, and we are part of a high-level, what we call the Track 1, facilitating the dialogue, but also among different stakeholders, of which media is one. The program that we use, or the avenue we use, is a program that we implement called the Shared Waters Partnership. And it's a very flexible mechanism, really tailoring to the needs of the governments or the stakeholders. So based on that, we hosted a unique training event for media representatives from the Eastern Nile countries, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt. And the focus was the GERD Dam, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. We have to be frank and say that the decision makers around shared waters, often politicians, politically active people, are influenced by media. Media influence public opinion. And to us, we wanted to explore how we could inform the media in a different way. And it turned out that not only were we able to provide them with the opportunity to jointly see the dam site, but to, between themselves, network and coordinate. And I really want to stress this, because the multi-track approach to finding ways to collaborate is key. So you need to anchor these decisions at different levels. I've been part, as I think I mentioned, supporting governments in Southern Africa for a very long time. And one of the most concrete examples, which really turned into an agreement between two countries, was when we hosted a dinner where it was an informal dinner where they shared their phone numbers, basically. It was very simple that the decision makers, they exchanged their numbers, so when the next rainy season came, they could pick up the phone. Creating that trust between the key stakeholders is key, and that can take place in many different ways. Often the informal way is much more successful. Just to summarize, I think what we're also seeing more and more is the global interdependencies beyond the region in itself, between the countries who share the same water resource. And that interdependency, we need to leverage that and use that as a catalytic force to incentivize governments to come in. Because one of the key incentives, and coming back to the two topics I mentioned in the beginning, what I feel in my experience from working with governments is that investments is the most fundamental incentive for them to sit at the table. I've been hosting meetings with finance institutions, private investors, and governments, and just trying to make them to speak the same language and understand each other has been challenging, but very important. So that incentive structure and communicating in a way that makes decision makers understand how the dependencies between the different parts of this region can optimize the use of the resource is fundamental. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, I think you, without maybe intending to, introduce another very interesting dimension into this discussion. You know, the way the panel is structured and that we deal with international politics and the implications of international water conflicts. But in fact, water is a source that is scarce domestically in many societies, and many of the conflicts that we're talking about as being part of the international arena are very much also a part of domestic conflicts. I mean, you know, in fact, I do recall one instance I saw when I was doing some work on what you might call political anthropology. We were looking at a village where a dam was being built, and some of the villagers, some of the lands would be getting water, but some of the lands that were high up would not be getting water. But the water administration didn't want to deprive those lands that wouldn't receive the irrigation water from being irrigated, so they decided to dig artesian wells. It's very easy to dig artesian wells. It takes much longer to build a dam and an irrigation system. So they dug the artesian wells, and suddenly the entire social system of the village was upset because the poorest people with the poorest land now had the irrigated land, and that transformed the power relationships and generated conflicts that you never imagined would come about, resulting in nightly destruction of water pumps at the artesian wells. So we're talking about a commodity, and I don't know if I should even use the word commodity, because there is some debate on this, that generates conflict if not properly managed, not only internationally, but equally so domestically. And we should be very aware of this. And maybe some of the techniques you employ internationally are also as relevant in terms of being employed in domestic conflict resolution regarding water. Well, we'll have a bit more time to talk about these things, but we do have sitting next to you Ambassador Yunt. I was particularly happy to see him because quite some years ago he helped us with our passports in Chicago. So now to see him as the director of a multilateral economic affairs, energy and environment section of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is a very particular pleasure for me to witness. Now, actually, of course, we are a society that's not blessed with abundance of water. We have enough of it to survive, but as our population is growing, we have to be sensitive about how we use it. And also we are in a location, as the minister this morning also expressed, that these waters that we have, at least some of them, are waters that also flow down the river to other neighbors, and we have to be mindful that the countries that are using these waters are not just exclusively our own people, but other people in the neighboring countries as well. So basically, you know, Emre, how shall we encourage cooperation among neighbors on water issues?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's great to see you again for some time after Chicago. Yes, as the minister stated this morning, Turkey is not a water-rich country, but we govern the water very successfully. So this is the issue. Of course, we have commitments as any country in the world. We cannot keep all the water to ourselves. We have to think about our neighbors. It's a human right to have the access to the water in the world, and we are committed to provide enough water, and we have been doing that for some time now to our neighbors. So, but there are, of course, factors which are affecting the amount of water we receive. Of course, one of them is the climate change, the growth of population, refugees coming in, need for new investments, so on and so forth. Of course, there are the conflicts, the terroristic attacks. Everything affects the availability of the water. So we have to be efficient in terms of using our water. I'm not talking about only Turkey, but the region or the whole world altogether. So the issue here is that cooperate among the riparian states in good faith, and we have to bring out new elements of technology, new investments in partnerships, and we have to be in constant dialogue so that we understand each other's demands, how to distribute the water, and how to govern the water. Because as Mr. Minister talked about maybe 20, 30 years ago in Istanbul, there was a huge scarcity of water in this country, in Istanbul. The same country which now provides more than enough water actually to the neighbors. But how did we solve this problem? Because with good governance and investment in the correct areas, and of course efficient use of technology. So this can, if we couldn't do that at that time, now we wouldn't be able to provide water to even to our own citizens, yet alone our neighbors. So this is the key factor. Everybody should get together and talk about how to efficiently, use the means available. There are not unlimited resources of water. There are no unlimited means of financial resources, and of course technology has its own limits as well. So if we are acting in good faith, we are not using water or other, issues to just gain an upper hand on the neighboring country for the sake of, putting pressure on the other side because of certain other reasons like political conflicts or other, hidden intentions. There is no reason that we couldn't cooperate, and we can do so. Turkey has a, accumulated, experience in terms of the management of water resources, investing in water, bringing technological solutions to problems, and we've been doing it here in our country and in other parts of the world, in Africa, in other areas. So we are ready to cooperate. We are not going to cut the water resources in any way from our neighbors. We are going to continue to provide them enough water, but of course the water has to be used efficiently, and it shouldn't be wasted. It's not an unlimited source of the world. The earth is being diminished, and we are receiving less and less rain and other sources. So we have to be careful in how to use the water available to us. This could be the short version of your question, or if you want, we can go on discussion the same subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Actually, when you look at Turkey, when people think about Turkey and water problems, they generally tend to think about Tigris and Euphrates. But in fact, Turkey has other waters, and actually, in these waters, significant cooperation have proven possible. The Araxes and also Maritsa, we do have rather, and Tunja, we have rather good cooperation with Bulgaria and Greece, and although we inherited from the Soviet Union with Armenia. And I don't know, would you want to say anything about that, or?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Actually, it's this. I would go back to this, maybe to the same thing that I just said ago. At the risk of repeating myself, the key is the good intention between the countries, neighboring countries. If you want to talk about water, we should talk about water only, and we shouldn't try to use water conflicts or different opinions as a tool to gaining an advantage or upper hand in political issues. Not everybody is, of course, we are living in a realistic world. Everybody thinks of its own interests at first, but as we have been saying till this morning, this is a human right. Everybody needs to have the access to the water resources, but sometimes the countries who have the better situation try to keep that situation on hand, and they don't want to share more water. They don't want to agree on creating a new kind of arrangement between countries. They do that, and we have some kind of issues with certain members in the West, neighbors in the West too. So we have to. This is a general problem, and the solution is everybody has to act in good faith, and we have to start talking. Water should not be, has never been, the only reason for starting a war. Wars are very costly, very deadly, very problematic for everybody. It's inhumane. So it's better to spend some more money on water investment than going to a war. And it's not worth going to a war on water, I think. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Just to set the, I don't want to use the wrong words, but the record straight, let us say, when we talk about water, it is often tempting to think about it only in terms of quantity available. And actually, what is, of course, equally important and which makes water more available is addressing questions of quality as well, because you may have water that you may not use because its quality is not suitable. You may have low quality water and you can improve its quality and make it usable, etc. So, I mean, you know, there seems to be an infinite number of ways of dealing with the problem. We should not confine ourselves to thinking that we should sort of negotiate only about the quantity of water available for this and that. Essentially, quantity of water or its availability may be enhanced by addressing questions of quality as well. But now, essentially, we've had a round of presentations, but let me ask you, Mr. Bino, if you were to ask a question to Therese Magnusson, what would you ask her? I mean, she heads an agency and you have a problem. Would she be able to offer you something, or would you ask for her wisdom? What do you think? Open the microphone.
I think that for countries like Jordan, when by 2030 there will be no water possible to allocate for agriculture, the only alternative is to use treated sewage. And fresh water will be used for domestic and industrial services. So we have to identify and resort to technologies that can treat the sewage to the most optimum quality for irrigation. And in this case, I think this situation is unique for Jordan. Not every country will have to resort for that. How can this CB or organization similar to that help these countries to deal with this situation and make the transfer smooth, maybe from now up to a decade, so that solutions can be affordable?
Quite a challenge, thank you. But indeed a very important question. I was fortunate to see your Minister of Water quite recently and talking exactly about these issues, which is the top priority of your government. I know that. I would say that basically, and referring to what you said, the value of water is not prioritized in society. I'm not talking only about the economic value. We need to elevate the water efficiency topic again. And what you're saying and referring to, Mr. Bino, the dual systems that exist in different parts of the world where you actually use treated water for certain things and you keep the fresh water for domestic purposes, it's doable. You can pump water, artificial recharge into an aquifer. You can store water differently. There are options, but there needs to be investments, and there needs to be a process approach on how to get there. Now, the challenge is that the needs are immediate, as Mr. Turk was referring to during his speech this morning. How do we balance this? Immediately now, the needs, and the more long-term. It takes 10 years to really make that investment. But to refer back to your question, what we can do, apart from that we have a very long-standing experience of facilitating informal and formal dialogue on these issues, what we can bring in is also, well, what kind of governance system is needed in order to make this happen? So water governance is really a key topic that we have long experience on, and that has both domestic, national context, but also a regional dimension because of the situation in the region. But moreover, and to conclude this, I would say that when I've been talking to private investors, investment bankers, they say we have the money. What's on the ground? What legal framework exists? How do you enforce the legislation? How do you make sure that, not me, but how does the government make sure that I get my money back? So I think this is something we really need to address, because The technology is there, the solutions are there are ideas and good practices of governance systems, but how do we make that link? And that's something we need to address.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. President, suppose you were the Secretary General of the United Nations. What would you ask the Turkish Foreign Service to do for you as regards addressing these water problems that we encounter?
Well, of course, I'm not Secretary General of the United Nations.
Well, we hope maybe.
Yes.
It's
Therefore, some of the more difficult questions I can safely and comfortably leave to others. But let me say something before I answer the question, which I find really fascinating in your conclusion or temporary conclusion, which you just made. You reminded us that very often the thinking is reduced to the quantities at the expense of quality.
Yeah.
And very often we do not see the complexity of a country's relations with neighbors, because this complexity involves more than one or two water courses normally, and it also includes a variety of elements of bilateral relations which do not necessarily have to do much with water, but they are part of the picture which is really decisive for the options that one would develop. I think that this is really very important to keep in mind. And why is this simplistic quantity-based calculation so prevalent? Now, I referred to Tapka Dam before in my statement. And of course, everybody has in mind the 1975 crisis between Syria and Iraq, which was a major crisis. And of course, that time it was easy to visualize the real danger of war, and it was possible to see a last-minute mediation by Saudi Arabia on that occasion, which prevented that war. Now, what we fail to understand is that majority of situations are vastly more complex in terms of the number of elements that have to be taken into account. Now, this brings me to the question of the position of decision makers. Now, look, let's say, if I was a Secretary General, how would I think about these problems? Now, we heard that decision makers do not necessarily, well, decision makers never function in a vacuum. It's not like, you have a completely clear definition of a problem and then the question of priorities. You work in a very, complicated environment, and media have a role. So if you go to a place like Egypt, I guess, it is not enough to say that technically Renaissance Dam can be managed. And obviously many would accept, yeah, sure, that is possible. But the management of politics, the management of public opinion, the management of everything that goes with them within a country, then it is what makes things complicated. Now, I have given a very long introduction to your to answering your question. I'd say
very informative. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I would say that somebody who is placed to be in a position where, with great responsibility, you address a member state of the United Nations. What would I ask Turkey? I say, look, I understand everything that I've said, all these complexities, all the reasons why things are usually understood in a simplified way. And my question then would be, look, could we sit down and you will tell me how do you see the problem and where do you see priorities at this moment? For example, in my speech this morning, I referred to Euphrates and Tigris. I think as chairman of a panel, I could do so. If I was Secretary General speaking here, I would not do so. That's pretty clear. And obviously, I would fully understand that the way the day-to-day developments in Syria are accumulating makes thinking about long-term needs much more complicated. If we thought 3 days ago that safe zones is something that one would approach in a more direct way, we know 3 days later that it will require quite a lot of work before that can be approached. And then, of course, that then has a huge impact on the wider bilateral picture. So, you know, I had to give this extremely long introduction to answer your question very briefly, to say, look, of course, I understand all these factors which make the picture so complicated, and therefore I would ask the ambassador of Turkey, I would say, sir, tell me, what are your priorities today? How can I help you? If not, feel free to come back when you think that I can.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. Well, actually, the answer to your question is very simple. You know, we have been hosting these refugees in Turkey for the last 5-6 years now. As our minister declared this morning, we have spent about 25 billion US dollars on refugees. This includes water investment. This includes you know, providing fresh water to these people. How can we make the rest of the world more conscious about this problem? If you want to call off a meeting, that's fine, we will attend. But if it's going to be only about talking, sitting down, talking and leaving, that's not worth it. We shouldn't waste our time, but we have to bring in real incentives to countries who were not interested in helping these people to the table. When the problem goes to their door, of course they are interested. But if it's when the issue stays in, you know, Turkey, Jordan, Syria, or around, nobody is much willing to do, you know, any sacrifice. I mean, last year when I was in the United States, we had a small gathering about the same issue, because this issue will continue for the, you know, foreseeable future. It's an unfortunate thing, but it's true. You know, some people from mostly the European Union countries talking about bringing in, you know, projects and you know, a detailed project and submitting it to the European Council, and then they will continue to talk about it. After a couple of months, they will decide on allocating this you know, kind of money, and then it will go to the regular procedures, and then in the end, after 2 years, you will receive maybe 1% of what you need in reality. But the project is very simple, Mr. Secretary General. People cross the border, they are afraid of dying, they are hungry, they are thirsty. You give them food and shelter and water. This is the project. Very simple. So we have to, tell all the member states that they shouldn't think only about themselves. They should provide for other people in the world. This is the key. If they continue to act selfish, this is the situation you get. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think time is progressing. Before I open the panel to questions from the floor, would anyone like to say anything that they wanted to say but could not say so far? Yes.
Thank you. I really want to build on what you're saying here, because and something that I forgot to mention about making trade-offs. Achieving cooperation very much has to do with a certain level of making trade-offs. So I would like to turn to Mr. Turk, our former president of a country. In that position, when you enter into a room to negotiate, how do you reflect? And because exactly what you're pointing at is it's not a vacuum for a decision maker, far from it. And how do you maneuver that? What guidance would you give? I have a certain, during my years in this field, I've probably come across one situation where one representative of a country at the meeting said, okay, we will do this trade-off. I know it's a tricky decision, but we see a broader benefits. So how would you react in a situation, in a room such as that?
Did you want to?
Sure, well, hypothetically, I would go the same way. But then, you know, the devil is in the details, as always, because, once again, all these decisions are very heavily contextual. I'll give you an example from a country which doesn't have any problem with, any sort of armed conflict, or two countries which are very far from that, but which have found themselves in a very unusual new situation as a result from global warming. Those two countries are Austria and Slovenia. We have an old regime of water cooperation for transboundary rivers between the two countries, and everything functioned very well. Now, as a result of new climate change-related violent weather events, we had a calamity resulting in floods which affected Slovenia. But Slovenians believe our affected people, companies, individuals, and so forth, that the water management on the Austrian side, which is upstream, was not adequate. That's our belief. Now, their belief was that they have followed all the protocols, just that this was a kind of a force majeure situation which could not be controlled. Now, the damages are quite substantial, and the questions are now before the courts. The courts are dealing with them on questions, which are simply litigation questions. They have not entered into the area of bilateral arrangements, bilateral agreements. Nobody asked for revision of our agreements on water management. So in that kind of situation, I would, if I was still president, I would initiate a discussion on revision and updating of water agreements, because I'm sure that global warming will produce new situations which we are not able to envisage today, and where we would need to act much more quickly. We would have to establish new types of communication, which we didn't have on that past occasion. And I would say, look, let us invest something in the establishment of procedures and, if necessary, also improvement of infrastructure. So that would be my sense of trade-off in that heavily contextual environment. I know that each situation is different, but each of them is characterized by a set of circumstances which have to be taken into account in total. And as I said, I would not dare to give any advice to my Turkish friends on how to handle their transboundary rivers, except for saying, well, institutional arrangements are usually quite helpful if they are possible, and they should be pursued with a sensitivity for new developments.
Well, it's most encouraging to hear that you have decided to use the courts for the time being rather than taking the law into your own hands. So I think that is very, very good. Now I'm going to be opening the floor for questions. We have a few minutes. I'd ask you, those of you who want to ask questions, to make it, if possible, brief and not a very prolonged one. And secondly, if possible again, name the person to whom you're directing the question. It will also be helpful if you first identify yourself. So thank you very much. The floor is open for questions. We have people with microphones that will deliver the microphone to you. Should you want to ask a question, you may ask for your compassion and understanding. It's not easy to see the floor from here when the light is sort of coming into your own eyes, so make sure that you signal very powerfully to catch my attention. Thank you. Questions? Any questions?
Thank you very much. I'm Mohammad Rafiq from Dhaka, Bangladesh. My question is, every city all over the world, people can drink the supply water of the municipality. But we see that Istanbul water, nobody can drink. What is the reason? I want to, Honorable Secretary General from the Turkish Foreign Ministry. Thank you.
I'm sorry, but could you repeat it slowly? I couldn't understand your question fully. I understand you're talking about Istanbul managing the water by municipality, but...
Istanbul municipality water, nobody can drink. Why? Everybody have to buy water from the outside. Nobody can drink the supply water. What is the reason?
If I'm not mistaken, you're asking the secret of bringing water to the cities without importing that from other areas. Is that the question?
I'm not sure this is something that the foreign ministry would
Yes,
be
I
able
was
to
going
answer.
to refer it anyway, because I don't know the reason, because I'm not
but-
representing
in
the
my
Istanbul
country-
Just one
municipality.
second, just.
In
And
my,
but I know this is a fact, and I'm happy that this is happening in our country, and we are proud of that. But the technical details, maybe Istanbul municipality can help you. You can apply to them.
But I think actually, for your information, at the source where the water is being pumped into the city distribution system, you can drink tap water. It is perfectly safe. The delivery systems are rather old, and there seems to be seepages along the way. In some cases, essentially mechanisms developed by citizens to ensure the availability of water all the time, particularly developed from the old times when there were periodic cuts in the system, tend to serve as polluting agents. This is number one. But number two is, you also are aware, sometimes the tap water is perfectly drinkable in some locations, but it is socially more desirable to drink bottled water. And after all, when you go to a restaurant now, like they will ask you sometimes even, what brand of water would you prefer, Aquapenna or San Pellegrino or Vichyos? So essentially, some of it is also not necessarily because the tap water is not drinkable, but it is socially more prestigious or desirable. And finally, of course, it is important that you transport water with you, and it seems to be extremely convenient to have bottled water with you to drink when you're traveling or when you're moving around town. But I think I'd agree with Ambassador Yunt that a sort of official of the municipal water system would have been infinitely more qualified than us to answer this question. But thank you. I think it's an important point that you raised.
thank you very much for your reply.
Thank you. You may also ask the question in Turkish, should you so desire. Let me.
Thank you, sir. My name is Sadiq Al-Malik from Iraq. Middle East and Iraq is located, is very arid area. Actually, we don't have any rainfall. The annual rainfall in most of Iraq is less than 100 millimeter per year. Actually, our region is hot and has many wars, and we don't like to add the water as new reason for the war, new war. So, as Iraqi people, ask the international community to help our region in Tigris and Euphrates to reach some kind of an agreement to share the benefit from Tigris and Euphrates rivers. My question and my direct question to Mr. Yunt, you said you are ready to cooperate with water. My question, are you ready as Turkey government to sign a framework agreement with the Liberian country based on Helsinki 1966 conventions or rules and the United Nations agreement use water course for non-navigation uses? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I did not dwell on that part very much before, but thank you for giving me the opportunity. As Minister Erol mentioned this morning, we want to pursue on the water issues directly with the riparian neighbors. So we don't think that the international organizations, the international conventions, agreements are fair, platforms to do that. So we don't want to, we are not party to most of the international agreements on this. So we Your Minister of Water was here, if I'm not mistaken, last month. They already met with Minister Eroğlu. It was a fruitful meeting. We will continue to talk to you, and we will reach and continue a pattern of dialogue. In the end, as we said before, we are not going to deprive any of our countries of water. If there is enough water for everyone, we will, of course, give the half of it. If there is less than enough water, we will make an efficient and optimum equitable distribution. This is it. But bringing in, United Nations, conventions, impositions from third parties, it will not work. I can tell you very, very clearly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. This is indeed a very complex question. In fact, I might add that as long as this international agreement that Turkey hasn't signed continues to assume that there are only downstream countries and no upstream countries, I think it will be rather difficult for Turkey to sign it. Yes, other questions? Well, oh yes, very good.
Maratignino from the Geneva Water Hub. I would like to ask a question to Ms. Therese. So you mentioned the transboundary water cooperation beyond water cooperation. So, for example, you mentioned the regional trade cooperation or irrigation schemes. I would like to ask you, how do you see the relationship with local communities? For example, transboundary water cooperation could prevent social conflicts or conflict between sectors at the national level? Thank you.
Thank you very much for a highly relevant question, something that we try to capture in our daily work, because our approach and our experience is that you have to address all of these issues at a multi-level scale, as I mentioned. That really is based on inclusive processes. That is fundamental. Now, when you're dealing with the so-called track 1 level, those are the broader discussions, the bigger picture. If you're fortunate, you're able to have the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in the room, the Ministry of Planning, the Ministry of Finance, so that they all have the same picture. But all of that needs to be based on consultation process at a track 2 or track 3 level, which means communities and people, organizations representing communities. That is fundamental. It also has to be clear that most of the prioritizations that are being made at the higher level are based on national plans, including job creation, improved livelihoods, and climate change adaptation and resilience mechanisms. All that has to do, including food production, with water. So what I'm trying to say is that I think the global community, including all actors involved in supporting transboundary cooperation, have not yet been extremely successful in capturing the community level. Personally, I've experienced from Southern Africa between Botswana, Namibia, and Angola. That program, the Every River Has Its People program, long ago, 15 years ago, really was built on community leaders, and they had access to the commissioners, the decision makers on the development of the Okavango River. That context was quite unique in how they could influence decision and prioritizations. Unfortunately, the gap is often too wide, and we need to strengthen that substantially. So I hope that clarified some. I just want to highlight that it's extremely important with inclusive processes. And while I have the floor, No one has really mentioned a topic that is a priority of the Swedish government, and it's also a priority of my team, and that is how we strengthen women in being part of the decision-making structures around shared waters. I don't have time to dwell on it here, but I think this is really a community issue, an inclusive process issue that we need to address. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, Alamuddin Babikir from Sudan. It's my pleasure to meet the panel here today. My question is regarding the longest river in the world, which is River Nile in Africa, Sudan. As you know, this river has been shared by more than 5 countries, and there is a historical agreement has been signed to share and divide the waters between the countries. Recently, Ethiopia has a plan to build a huge dam in the area, and there is conflict between Ethiopia and Egypt. I'm sorry, I just attend the session lightly. I don't know whether you touch this issue or not, but I want to hear from the panel how could manage this situation between the countries and to share the resources. But they said they want to build a dam for developing purposes, electric purposes, and so on. So I would like to hear from the panel how do you see the situation and this issue could be managed so we can keep the peace in Africa. Thank you.
Who was the question to?
No, I just, for my name?
Who was the question directed to?
The question for panel.
For the panel?
Yes.
All right. Mr. President.
Since you have very generously suggested some of the more difficult questions to me, I'd be happy to start, but I'm sure that Ms. Magnusson would have much to say, because this is one of those situations which have a very long history and very rich context, and I'm sure that you have mentioned the experience, specific experience, which you may perhaps wish to share with everybody here. I would just make a few fairly general remarks. I mean, from what I can see is that there is a fair amount of discussion going on and fair amount of technical work which should be able to kind of calm down the situation. I mean, the Renaissance system is more or less built, and the question of filling the reservoirs has technical answers. I mean, technically that seems to be manageable. Of course, it's more complex than that because of the whole politics and history, political sensitivities, essentially. Now, I do not have very much to say about that because I know that there are very many different technically capable actors involved in a very wide variety of advisory activities around that. So I hope that that would work. But there are 2 points that I would like to add which are not of immediate relevance but are somehow relevant on the long run. The first is that we have noticed in the discussion in the Security Council, which I started with a briefing last November, the speakers from Egypt and Ethiopia taking the floor in a manner which suggested to me a fairly open-minded and conciliatory approach. I mean, there are people from capitals who came for the occasion and spoke in a spirit which I consider to be positive. Some people would say very positive, but nobody would qualify it as negative. As you know, in the United Nations, that's already an achievement. I mean, to have an atmospheric expression of that kind at the level of the Security Council. That's important to notice. The second thing is the growing understanding of the importance of an institutional setting that has to be developed gradually. I mean, these kind of things are likely to be let us assume that the current problems are resolved successfully, there will be a need for an increased capacity of institutional character to look at things on a daily basis, to propose revisions or improvements and so forth. So I believe that one with the understanding of long history, complexity and sensitivity of this situation, one can voice a degree of good expectations, which is slightly less than measured optimism, but close to that.
Well, thank you very much. You know, when I was given the job of running this panel as the first panel of the afternoon, I was gravely concerned because generally, if you have a sumptuous lunch, it is not necessarily the first thing that comes to your mind to attend a panel, but take a nap. But I must say that the panel was exciting and full of ideas, and the danger which I anticipated did not come to materialize. So I'm particularly thankful to the members of the panel for having made it so interesting that we had an exciting panel. In fact, this morning, the minister referred to the fact that some sort of a maybe declaration should come out. I think that is probably a idea that may be worked on. Certainly some of the ideas here may be added to that, and maybe some committee may be established to work on it, so a year from now there might be some sort of a statement on which there is a consensus. But may I ask all of you to join me in thanking all the wonderful people on this panel that made the afternoon so enjoyable. Well, do come back next year to our panel and make it more enjoyable again. Thank you very much. And we have very little time, as you know. There are other activities planned right at 4 o'clock, and it is 3 minutes of 4. So please rush to your next meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you.